Good evening. Tonight, we travel back to Europe in the years after the First World War, a time of uncertainty, a time of hardship, and a time when millions of people were searching for answers. It was in this environment that a little-known man named Adolf Hitler would begin a journey that would eventually reshape the course of world history, not because he started with great power, not because he inherited a throne, but because he entered a nation struggling with defeat, economic crisis, and political instability. To understand Hitler's rise, we first need to understand Germany after 1918. The First World War had ended. Millions had died. Entire regions had been devastated, and Germany had been defeated. The war's end came as a shock to many Germans. For years, government propaganda had suggested that victory was still possible. Many citizens did not expect the sudden collapse that arrived in late 1918. The German Empire fell, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and a new democratic government emerged. This government became known as the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic inherited enormous problems. The economy was damaged, political violence was widespread, and trust in government was weak. Many Germans blamed different groups for the nation's difficulties. Political parties argued constantly, street clashes became common, and extremist movements on both the left and right began attracting attention. The situation became even more difficult after the Treaty of Versailles. Signed in 1919, the treaty formally ended the war, but many Germans viewed its terms as harsh and humiliating. Germany lost territory, military restrictions were imposed, and large financial reparations were required. Whether justified or not, many citizens felt angry, and that anger created opportunities for politicians who promised dramatic change. One of those politicians was Adolf Hitler. At this point, he was not famous, he was not powerful, and very few people outside local political circles knew his name. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler had experienced a difficult early life. He struggled academically, failed to gain admission to art school, and spent years drifting between jobs and ambitions. When the First World War began, he joined the German army. The war became a defining experience for him. He served as a messenger, witnessed violence firsthand, and developed strong political views. When Germany lost the war, Hitler reacted with anger and bitterness. Like many others, he searched for explanations, but instead of accepting complex political and military causes, he embraced conspiracy theories and extreme nationalist ideas. These beliefs would shape everything that followed. After the war, Hitler remained connected to military circles, and it was through one of these assignments that he encountered a small political organization in Munich, the German Workers' Party. At the time, it was tiny, unknown, and politically insignificant. Yet Hitler quickly discovered something important. He had a talent for public speaking. When he spoke, people listened, not because his ideas were unique, but because he delivered them with unusual intensity, emotion, and confidence. In an era filled with uncertainty, many people were drawn to individuals who appeared certain, and Hitler projected certainty even when discussing complicated problems. As attendance at meetings grew, so did his influence within the party. Soon, he became one of its most recognizable figures. The organization eventually changed its name. It became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, often known simply as the Nazi Party. At first, it remained small. Most Germans paid little attention to it, and many political observers dismissed it entirely. But Hitler believed Germany's instability created opportunity. He believed dissatisfaction could be transformed into political support, and he dedicated himself to expanding the movement. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be failures, setbacks, and moments when his political career appeared finished. Yet each crisis also created new possibilities, and in the years ahead, Germany would experience challenges that would dramatically increase the appeal of extremist solutions. For now, however, Hitler remained a relatively obscure political activist, ambitious, determined, and convinced that Germany's future could be shaped by his vision. The world had not yet noticed him, but that would soon change. And that is where the next chapter of our story begins. A story not only about one man, but about the social, economic, and political conditions that allowed him to rise. Adolf Hitler had become an increasingly visible figure within a small political party in Germany. He was attracting attention, building support, and speaking to crowds that were growing larger with each passing year. But despite this progress, the Nazi Party remained a minor force. Germany was still dominated by larger and more established political organizations. And Hitler faced a difficult question. How could a small movement seize power in a country of millions? During the early 1920s, Germany was experiencing severe instability. The economy struggled, political violence erupted frequently, and confidence in the democratic government remained fragile. One of the most dramatic crises came in 1923. Hyperinflation, a financial disaster that devastated everyday life. Prices rose at astonishing speed. Money lost value almost overnight. Workers were often paid several times a day because wages became worthless so quickly. Families watched savings disappear. Businesses struggled to function, and many citizens felt abandoned by traditional political leaders. The crisis created fear, but it also created opportunity for extremist groups, promising simple solutions to complex problems. Hitler watched these events closely, and he became convinced that Germany was approaching a revolutionary moment. Inspired partly by political movements elsewhere in Europe, he believed that a decisive action might allow his movement to seize power quickly. This belief led to one of the most important turning points in his early political career. The Beer Hall Putsch. In November 1923, Hitler and his supporters attempted to overthrow regional authorities in Munich. Their goal was ambitious: to spark a wider revolution that would eventually spread throughout Germany. The plan depended on gaining support from influential military and political figures, but support proved unreliable. Events unfolded differently than expected. What began as a dramatic political gamble quickly became disorganized. Authorities responded, police forces intervened, and the attempted coup collapsed. Several people were killed during clashes, many participants were arrested, and the movement appeared defeated. For Hitler, personally, the consequences were serious. He was arrested and charged with treason. Many observers believed his political career was over. Yet, something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing from public attention, Hitler gained more of it. His trial became a national story, and he used the courtroom as a stage. Rather than defending himself quietly, he delivered lengthy speeches. He presented himself as a patriot acting in Germany's interests, and newspapers across the country reported on the proceedings. For many Germans, this was the first time they had heard his name. The court ultimately found him guilty, and he was sentenced to prison. On the surface, this appeared to be a major defeat, but prison gave Hitler something he had rarely possessed before: time. Time to think, time to plan, and time to reconsider how political power could actually be achieved. While imprisoned, he dictated much of what would become his political manifesto. A book later published as Mein Kampf, the book outlined many of the ideas that would later shape Nazi ideology: extreme nationalism, authoritarian leadership, racial theories, and hostility toward democracy. Historians continue to study the book because it revealed many of Hitler's long-term goals years before he gained power. Yet at the time, relatively few people paid close attention to it. Most Germans were focused on daily life, rather than political manifestos. Prison also taught Hitler an important lesson. He concluded that seizing power through a sudden uprising was unlikely to succeed. Germany's institutions remained strong enough to suppress a coup. If he wanted power, he would need a different strategy, not revolution. Politics. When Hitler was released from prison, he returned to a movement that had weakened during his absence. The Nazi Party was divided, membership had fallen, and resources were limited. Many leaders would have been discouraged. Hitler was not. Instead, he began rebuilding, patiently, systematically, and with a clearer plan than before. The party expanded its local organizations, held meetings across Germany, printed newspapers, distributed propaganda, and recruited new supporters. Hitler also worked to strengthen his control over the movement itself. He wanted centralized leadership, a structure in which authority flowed downward from the top. Over time, the party developed a recognizable identity, symbols, uniforms, flags, public rallies, and carefully managed events. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They energized supporters, created a sense of belonging, and projected an image of strength. For many people attending such events, the experience was as important as the political message itself. Germany in the mid-1920s gradually stabilized, economic conditions improved, political tensions eased somewhat, and support for extremist parties declined. As a result, the Nazi Party remained relatively small. To many observers, Hitler appeared destined to remain a fringe political figure, someone who had attracted temporary attention but would never reach national leadership. History, however, rarely follows predictable paths, because while Germany experienced a period of relative stability, a much larger crisis was approaching, a crisis that would spread far beyond Germany's borders, a crisis that would transform politics across the world. And when that crisis arrived, Adolf Hitler would find himself positioned to take advantage of it. The movement he had rebuilt would suddenly gain new relevance. The speeches that once attracted small crowds would begin drawing much larger audiences, and the path toward national power would begin to open. The crisis arrived in 1929. It began with a financial collapse in the United States, but it did not remain there. What became known as the Great Depression spread across the world, affecting economies, governments, and millions of ordinary people. Germany was particularly vulnerable. Its economy relied heavily on foreign loans and investment. When those financial connections weakened, the consequences were severe. Businesses failed, factories reduced production, and unemployment rose dramatically. For many families, daily life became increasingly uncertain. Workers lost jobs, savings disappeared, and opportunities became harder to find. The economic difficulties created frustration, but they also created fear. Fear about the future, fear about stability, and fear about whether democratic institutions could solve the country's problems. Political parties across Germany struggled to provide answers. Coalition governments formed and collapsed. Arguments became more intense, and confidence in traditional leadership weakened. In this atmosphere, extremist movements gained attention, not because everyone agreed with them, but because many people were desperate for solutions. Hitler and the Nazi Party positioned themselves as a movement that offered certainty. Their message was simple: Germany had problems, those problems had causes, and they claimed to have answers. The simplicity of the message appealed to many people, living through difficult times. Complex explanations often require patience. Simple explanations spread more easily, especially during periods of crisis. The Nazi Party expanded rapidly, membership increased, public rallies grew larger, and the organization became more visible throughout Germany. Political campaigns became highly organized. Posters appeared in cities and towns. Speeches were carefully planned. Messages were repeated consistently. Hitler traveled extensively, speaking before audiences of different sizes, sometimes thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands. His speaking style differed from many traditional politicians. He rarely sounded detached or academic. Instead, he spoke emotionally, with intensity, and with a confidence that attracted supporters. Many listeners felt he understood their frustrations. Others strongly disagreed with him, but very few ignored him. As elections approached, the Nazi Party transformed from a fringe movement into a major political force. In the election of 1930, the party made significant gains. Suddenly, political leaders who had dismissed Hitler were forced to take him seriously. Yet, gaining votes was not the same as gaining power. Germany remained a democracy, and many obstacles still stood between Hitler and national leadership. The early 1930s became a period of political instability. Governments struggled to maintain support, economic difficulties continued, and divisions deepened across society. Election followed election, coalitions formed and broke apart, political negotiations became increasingly complicated. At the same time, street violence remained a concern. Different political groups clashed, tensions grew, and many citizens worried about the future of the country. Within elite political circles, some leaders believed they could use Hitler for their own purposes. They saw him as popular, influential, and useful, but they assumed he could be controlled. This assumption would prove to be one of the most consequential miscalculations in modern history. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become one of the largest political forces in Germany. Hitler himself ran for the presidency. He did not win, but the campaign increased his national profile even further. Millions of Germans now knew his name. Millions had heard his speeches, and millions viewed him as a potential leader. Behind the scenes, political negotiations intensified. Government officials searched for ways to create stable administrations, but stability remained difficult to achieve. Eventually, a group of influential politicians and advisors proposed a solution. They believed Hitler could be appointed to a leadership position while remaining under the influence of more experienced figures. They thought they could manage him, guide him, and limit his power. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. It was a constitutional appointment, not a military takeover, not a revolution, but a political decision made within the existing system. Many people viewed the appointment as temporary. Some believed the government would soon collapse. Others expected Hitler to moderate once in office. Few understood how quickly events would unfold. For Hitler, becoming Chancellor was not the final goal. It was the beginning of a new phase, a phase focused on consolidating power, eliminating opposition, and transforming Germany's political system. The democratic institutions that had allowed his rise would soon face their greatest test. Once Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, events moved quickly, much faster than many of his political opponents expected. Many believed they could limit his influence. Many believed Germany's institutions would restrain him. But those assumptions soon proved incorrect. Only weeks after Hitler took office, a dramatic event shook Germany. The Reichstag Fire destroyed much of the German parliament building. The cause of the fire remains debated by historians, but its political consequences were immediate. The government used the crisis to justify emergency measures. Civil liberties were restricted, political opponents faced increased pressure, and state authority expanded dramatically. For many citizens, these changes appeared temporary, emergency actions during a time of crisis, but the restrictions did not disappear. Over the following months, opposition parties found it increasingly difficult to operate. Critics were silenced, political rivals were marginalized, and power became concentrated in fewer hands. Germany's democratic system, already weakened by years of instability, gradually lost its ability to function independently. The Nazi Party strengthened control over public institutions, government agencies, educational systems, media organizations, and many aspects of daily life. Propaganda became an important tool. Messages were carefully managed. Public events were organized on a massive scale, and the government worked continuously to shape public opinion. Many Germans supported these developments. Others remained uncertain, and some opposed them openly. But opposition became increasingly dangerous. As power expanded, the government introduced policies based on exclusion, discrimination, and racial ideology. Groups were targeted, rights were restricted. What began as political change evolved into something much larger, a system built around centralized authority and unquestioned leadership. During the following years, Germany experienced economic improvements in some areas. Large public projects were launched, military spending increased, and unemployment declined. These developments strengthened support among many citizens, but they also helped prepare the country for future conflict. Hitler's ambitions extended beyond domestic politics. He sought territorial expansion, military growth, and greater influence across Europe. Throughout the 1930s, tensions increased. Neighboring countries watched developments with growing concern. Diplomatic efforts attempted to maintain peace, but the situation became increasingly unstable. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The invasion triggered the beginning of World War II, a conflict that would become the deadliest war in human history. Over the next 6 years, millions of soldiers and civilians would be drawn into the fighting. Entire cities would be destroyed, nations would be transformed, and unimaginable suffering would occur across multiple continents. Among the darkest aspects of this period was the Holocaust. Millions of innocent people were persecuted and murdered under Nazi policies, including Jewish communities, political opponents, and many other targeted groups. The consequences of these actions remain among the most studied and remembered events in modern history. As the war continued, Germany initially achieved major military successes. Large areas of Europe came under Nazi control, but over time, the conflict shifted. Powerful alliances formed against Germany, resources became strained, and military setbacks increased. By 1945, the situation had changed dramatically. German forces were retreating, major cities had been heavily damaged, and defeat was becoming unavoidable. In April 1945, as Allied forces advanced toward Berlin, Hitler remained inside a bunker beneath the city. The vast empire he had attempted to build was collapsing around him. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in Berlin. Days later, Nazi Germany surrendered. The war in Europe came to an end. The story of Hitler's rise is not simply the story of one individual. It is also the story of economic crisis, political instability, weak institutions, propaganda, and the dangers that can emerge when democratic systems lose public trust. Historians continue to study this period not because it is comfortable to examine, but because understanding it remains important. The rise of Adolf Hitler demonstrates how quickly societies can change during times of fear and uncertainty, how political movements can grow during crises, and how decisions made by individuals, institutions, and governments can shape the lives of millions. Today, the buildings, speeches, and rallies of that era belong to history. The leaders are gone, the war has ended, and the world has changed, but the lessons remain. Quiet reminders from the past, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be understood. And so, our story comes to an end. A story that began with a struggling post-war nation. A small political movement and a little-known speaker, and ended with a global conflict that reshaped the modern world. Now, let the events of history drift gently into the distance. Let the noise of politics fade, let the crowds disappear, and let the world become quiet once more. Sleep peacefully, and let the night carry you onward.